hello. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm really excited about the people that I was kind of grouped with because I felt so many connections as I was listening to you all talk about some of the themes that I'd like to talk about tonight. So I'm originally from El Paso, Texas, born and raised, and because I've spent my whole life on the border, I really see the border as being three different things, separate but interrelated ideas. So first we have borders as kind of lines of division. So the way that, we might hear someone on the news talk about the border is that it's this militarized zone. It's a line of division. It's us versus them. And there's this need for strict separation. So I feel like that's really kind of a framework, especially that the media perpetuates about the border. But it's also, I know from growing up there that it's a space. It's not just a line on the ground. It's a space where people live their lives and people cross back and forth and people form relationships and bonds with one another. And so for me, the border is also, it's not just a line, it's also a space that emerges around that line. And then finally, one of my favorite authors, Gloria Anzaldúa, talks about the border as a form of consciousness. So when you live in a space that, anyone who's been to El Paso knows that the U.S. doesn't end at one point and Mexico begins. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of blending of cultures, of languages, of ideas. And so Gloria Anzaldúa argues that people at borders, because we're faced with all of these contradictions and we have to find some way to make sense of them, that we develop a kind of consciousness that is tolerant of complexity, of ambiguity, and all of these lines of division. We find a way to make sense of them. And so this is kind of the framework that, without even trying, I just naturally adopted. It's the way that I see the world. It's the way that I've moved through the world. And so this can become problematic when I encounter places where there is a desire to create division, to strictly categorize people as this or that, to keep some people in and keep some people out. And so the church that I was raised in, I felt really reinforced division more than it created unity. And so I felt that there was a lot of kind of judgment, a lot of separation, division, and for all of these reasons, when I was 18 years old, I got to a point where I couldn't really continue my participation in the church that I grew up in. And in that moment, I learned that while I still have my own form of spirituality or my own relationship to spirituality, I couldn't continue it in the church where I grew up. And so when I came to Albuquerque to study at University of New Mexico, I was lucky enough to come visit East Central Ministries as just part of a field trip for a class that I was in. And I met Morgan, and we shoveled some rocks, and it was awesome. And so, but I really was struck by this idea that there are so many different people who live in this neighborhood who participate with this organization. And I mean, just this neighborhood itself is labeled the International District, and you see a sign signaling when you've crossed into this space. So for me, I immediately identified with this neighborhood as a border space. I saw it as there are these lines of division, but there are also so many opportunities for transcending those lines of division and for people to work together for something bigger. And so as I began to spend more time here, and I would bring some of my students to do different projects. One of my favorite things about ECM was that there were so many people from multiple faith backgrounds, or no faith background at all. But the the central focus was always not what separates us, but what are we trying to accomplish together? What are some of the goals of the organization? How do various volunteers and visitors help meet those goals? And so as our relationship continued to develop, and I did my dissertation research here, something that really stood out to me was this, what I saw as a kind of way to approach faith differently than anything else I had ever experienced growing up or encountered anywhere else. ECM was a unique place for me. And so as part of the reading that I had to do for my dissertation, I found one of Gloria Anzaldua's concepts talked about how do we have kind of a bordered experience of religion or of spirituality, and she calls the ability to transcend divisions in spirituality as spiritual mestizaje. And so as soon as I read about this concept, I really felt like this is what's happening at ECM. This is what I'm experiencing every day, and this is what's creating opportunities in this community that are different from any other community I visited in Albuquerque. So for example, I know that we've heard a little bit about, earlier today, about the housing co-op, Casa Shalom, and I feel like this is one of the best examples, best representations of this idea. So you have a group of people who have committed to living together, supporting one another, sharing resources like food, shelter, sharing time is an important resource to really connect with others. And I feel that this approach to spirituality makes more sense to me than anything else I've encountered, like I said before. So much so that when I did move back to El Paso after finishing my degree at UNM, when my partner and I moved to El Paso, we moved into this neighborhood where nobody really knew each other, people didn't interact, and it felt very isolated. And I started thinking through, how did ECM teach me to live out values, to be in community with other people, and I appreciated that so much. Why am I not doing that in my life now that I've moved home to my border community? And so they, Morgan and John and Stephen and Bob came to visit Jason and I spring of last year, and I was lucky enough to meet Sammy. And so now I get to practice that community living. Jason and I live in Sammy's basement, and we get to watch. We have an attic too, if anybody wants. Yeah, you should come join our community. But this has been so valuable for me, and because we have this opportunity to watch Sammy's kids, and Jason and I don't have kids, but we're lucky enough that they'll watch our dog for us if we have to go out of town. And something so small as having these awesome kids that take really great care of our dog and are so sweet to her, it sounds like something small, but it's so, it relieves so much stress, and it just feels, these small things that we do for each other are really something that I learned from ECM can be really powerful. Helping each other with different life issues as they come up, sharing time, making sure that you're intentional about the time that you're sharing with other people. And so for me, my biggest life takeaway from working with ECM was this idea that despite some of the issues that I might have encountered in the church that I grew up in, there is this way to practice spirituality that I can really connect with, that I can really see as very social justice oriented, very community oriented, and that is the best. Not only, it was a great research lesson to learn, but more importantly, it was the best life lesson that I could have learned. So thank you all for teaching me that. And that's, I like to answer any questions that you have, but that's really all I have to share with you tonight.
about border spaces, having more a fluid sense of borders and place and lines. Is there a way, do you think, to cultivate that in places that aren't border spaces? How do you cultivate that?
Definitely. So it's amazing that you asked that question because we just talked about this in my class yesterday. But Gloria Anzaldúa argues that borders aren't just geographic. Whenever one or more cultures encounter one another, there's some border that emerges. So some examples that we talked about in class were sometimes there are borders between one side of our family has one way of doing things and the other side of our family is completely different, and we find ourselves trying to adapt. How am I going to be with my dad's side of the family, and what do I need to do to adapt to spend time with my mom's side of the family? So I'm kind of crossing back and forth in those spaces. And so I think that, and the International District, again, is a great example of how we're not technically crossing the Mexico-U.S. border, but there are sorts of borders. There are ideas of division. Some people in this community feel like they've been pushed out of other spaces in Albuquerque, and so out of that line of division, I think there have been, the health clinic is an excellent example of how there are certain limitations in the healthcare system. Certain people encounter boundaries, they don't have access. And so we can fight those boundaries, or like ECM has done, we can just figure out a completely different way to approach healthcare. And we can transcend the boundary altogether and come up with something brand new that works in a special way. And I think without that initial boundary of healthcare, there wouldn't have been a way to figure out how to transcend the binary and come up with this amazing approach to healthcare. Does that make sense? Okay. Thanks. Thank you so much.